There are crimes that fade with time, and then there are those that never let the world forget. Chris Watts didn't just destroy a family. He fractured the illusion of the perfect modern home, the smiling photos, the filtered posts, the endless proof of happiness. Behind that front door in suburban Colorado, something far darker was unfolding. Something that would stain the very concept of trust. Years later, people still search his name. They replay the interviews, the body cam footage, the courtroom tears. They want to understand how a man who looked so ordinary, a husband, a father, a neighbor, could erase everything that defined him. But this story isn't about the night of August 13, 2018. It's about what came before, and what came after. It's about why it still haunts us, why we still lean forward every time new letters, new confessions, new whispers from a prison cell surface. Because somewhere inside those confessions, there's a truth no one has fully faced. Inside a cell hundreds of miles from home, Chris Watts now writes about God, guilt, and the woman who changed everything, Nichol Kessinger. He calls her the beginning of the end. Others call her the ghost who vanished. In those letters, she's both muse and mirror, the reflection of who he wanted to become, and the reminder of what he destroyed to get there. But this story isn't hers alone. It's also Shanann's, a woman who built her life online, loved loudly, and tried endlessly to hold together a home already collapsing beneath appearances. This documentary isn't just about murder. It's about deception, digital intimacy, and the loneliness that hides behind curated smiles. It's a study in human fracture, the kind that starts small, quiet, and invisible, until it consumes everything. Because what happened in that Colorado home wasn't sudden. It was growing, in text messages, in secrets, in silence. And by the time the world noticed, it was already too late. They looked like the dream. The kind of family that social media loves. Two bright little girls, a pregnant wife, a husband with a gentle smile. Every post glowed with sunlight, each caption filled with gratitude, each video showing laughter echoing through a spotless Colorado home. Shanann Watts didn't just share her life, she built it in real time, one Facebook Live at a time. But behind the filters and rehearsed affection, there was exhaustion. A quiet imbalance growing louder. Shanann was carrying not just a baby, but the weight of perfection. She filmed through migraines, smiled through pain, and kept posting even when she could feel Chris slipping away. Every update was a performance of hope, a digital plea for connection. Chris played his role well. The supportive husband. The father who built swing sets and hugged his daughters goodnight. He stood beside her on camera, eyes soft, voice calm. But off-screen, the silence between them was stretching. He had learned to smile without meaning it. To nod without listening. To perform love while feeling nothing. The internet saw a couple thriving, their friends saw something breaking. Late-night texts hinted at distance. Missed calls multiplied. Even in family videos, his body language told a story that words could not: stiff shoulders, forced laughter, eyes that wandered elsewhere. And yet, the world loved them. The algorithm rewarded their togetherness. Every like, every comment, every emoji became part of a lie neither of them could escape. Because once a family becomes content, the line between reality and performance disappears. That's the paradox of modern tragedy. We watch lives unravel while double-tapping the illusion. We mistake smiles for peace, captions for truth. We forget that sometimes, the most broken homes look the most beautiful online. In Shanann's last months, she still called him her hero. Still believed the man she met was hiding somewhere behind that blank stare. But Chris was no longer living with her. He was acting beside her. A ghost in his own story. And when the curtain finally fell, the audience, millions of strangers scrolling through her life, would be left staring at the same question Shanann never saw coming: what if the life we envy most is the one closest to collapse? Every picture-perfect home has its pressure points. For the Watts family, the cracks began where most marriages quietly fracture: in money, in misunderstanding, in the slow erosion of empathy. It started small. A missed glance. A sigh at the wrong time. But beneath that silence, entire walls were beginning to give way. Finances were tighter than the photographs suggested. Medical bills, credit cards, mortgage payments, the invisible weight that never made it to Facebook. Shannon, determined and meticulous, carried most of it on her shoulders. She sold products online, organized her life like a brand, and measured her worth in engagement and consistency. She was fighting to build stability in a world that demanded constant performance. Chris withdrew further. To his co-workers, he was polite, disciplined, mild-mannered. But at home, his emotional absence was like a fog that never lifted. The man who once sent morning texts and handwritten notes now moved through rooms without a word. He smiled when expected, a mechanical gesture of familiarity, but it carried no warmth. Then came the tension between Shannon and Chris's mother, Cindy Watts. It wasn't just a family disagreement, it was a battle of control. Boundaries blurred, tempers clashed, and Shannon found herself standing alone in a war she didn't start. She confided in friends through texts, exhaustion, fear, and a haunting sense that she was fighting for her marriage against an invisible wall. "He's not the same," she wrote. "He doesn't look at me the way he used to." What no one saw was how loneliness began to mutate inside her. She compensated with structure, schedules, meal plans, routines. But structure can't replace affection. She tried harder. She planned vacations, sent messages filled with love. Yet love was no longer being received. The smiles continued, even as her world shrank into quiet panic. The very audience she sought comfort from only deepened her isolation. Because once you share your life online, people don't see you, they see the story they want to believe. In those final weeks before the storm, Shannon's optimism was still visible, but her eyes betrayed the truth. Behind the smile lived a woman running out of hope. And behind hers, a husband already living another life. The house hadn't fallen yet. But the foundations had already cracked. There is a moment, invisible to everyone, when a man decides to become someone else. For Chris Watts, that moment didn't come with violence. It came quietly, in the gym, in secret phone calls, in the glow of a second phone hidden beneath his pillow. He began to sculpt a new version of himself, leaner, sharper, freer. The faithful husband became a stranger in his own reflection. Co-workers noticed first, the sudden fitness obsession, the constant checking of messages, the faint cologne of reinvention. What looked like self-improvement was in fact erasure. He wasn't adding to his life, he was shedding it. Each run, each text to Nichol Kessinger, peeled away another piece of the man his wife once knew. Nichol was drawn to the man he presented, quiet, gentle, recently divorced, or so he said. To her, he was an escape from the chaos of her own world. To him, she was a mirror that reflected the fantasy he craved, a life unburdened by history, responsibility, or consequence. Together, they built a fragile illusion of freedom, built on lies spoken softly in the dark. But lies demand energy. And Chris began to fracture under their weight. Each morning, he returned to Shannon's world, the world of lists, bills, family videos, and each night, he slipped back into his secret one. The distance between them became measurable in hours, in messages deleted before dawn. He grew addicted to the contrast, the thrill of newness against the quiet suffocation of routine. It wasn't love. It was escape, the kind of escape that becomes dangerous when it begins to feel like truth. At work, he smiled more. At home, he barely spoke. The girls noticed, too, their father's eyes now somewhere else, their bedtime hugs colder, shorter. Shannon could feel it. She wrote about it in texts, pleaded for honesty, begged for connection. But he was already gone, living two lives, performing both. In every story of betrayal, there's a moment of choice, a point when turning back is still possible. For Chris, that moment came and went without a sound. The man who once held his daughters in his arms now held a secret that would end them all. Because double lives don't stay hidden forever. Eventually, one must destroy the other. Every family hides a war that outsiders never see. At I and the Watts household, that war was fought in silence, between exhaustion and expectation, illness and endurance, love and control. Shanann's life had become a fragile balance between holding her family together and holding herself upright. Her lupus flared without warning. There were mornings she could barely rise, yet she still filmed cheerful videos, still smiled for an audience that expected joy. Behind every clip was a woman pushing through pain because she believed that keeping up appearances would save her marriage. If she could just stay strong, maybe he would stay, too. But strength has a breaking point. Chris had stopped noticing her battles long before the world did. The man who once warmed her feet under the blanket now turned his back to her in bed. When she reached for him, she touched absence. When she spoke, she met silence. Friends remember her messages, words heavy with confusion and fear. He doesn't touch me. He doesn't look at me. In those confessions, you can feel the heartbreak of a woman still trying to rationalize neglect as something temporary. She blamed herself, her illness, her stress. Never the possibility that love had already left. When she flew to North Carolina that summer, she thought distance might heal them. It didn't. Instead, it exposed everything she had been refusing to see. The in-law tension grew colder, her texts went unanswered, and Chris's detachment turned into hostility masked as calm. Pregnant and exhausted, Shanann returned home to a man she barely recognized, thinner, distant, rehearsed. She sensed another presence in his life but couldn't prove it. She pleaded for clarity, sent long messages, wrote notes of love and forgiveness. But Chris had already made peace with his secret. His mind was somewhere else, building a fantasy that didn't include her. The tragedy of their final days wasn't just betrayal, it was misunderstanding. One fought for connection, the other fought for escape. She was clinging to what once was, he was erasing it in real time. By August, their home was quieter than ever. No shouting, no arguments, just stillness, the kind that feels like mourning before the death itself. And somewhere in that stillness, a terrible decision was already forming. When the cameras arrived, the house looked untouched, the porch light still glowing, toys scattered, family photos perfectly framed. But beneath that silence was a horror no one could yet see. What began as a missing persons report would become one of the most haunting investigations in modern history. The first to arrive were officers, calm, methodical, unaware they were stepping into a performance. Chris opened the door with a nervous smile, feigning confusion. His voice was soft, almost rehearsed, as he spoke of worry and disbelief. Behind him, the air felt heavy, too quiet, too still. Every move was being recorded, every glance preserved for eternity in the bodycam's lens. On screen, he looked helpful. Cooperative. He paced, talked, gestured, all the motions of concern without the pulse of real panic. When an officer asked to search the house, Chris agreed instantly, but his eyes betrayed calculation. The refrigerator door swung open. The bedrooms were checked. Shanann's purse and phone still there, untouched. The illusion of missing was already crumbling. The footage would later become infamous. Millions would watch it online, searching for the micro-expressions, the blinking, the shallow breathing, the anatomy of deceit. Chris wasn't just living through an investigation. He was performing inside one. Then came the interrogation room. No cameras for show, no neighbors watching, just fluorescent light and truth pressing down. Investigators played the footage back, dissecting his every move. They knew. The polygraph would confirm it, he failed spectacularly. When his father entered the room, it was one of the most haunting moments ever recorded. Two men, a lifetime of trust, now facing the unthinkable. Chris's voice trembled as he confessed, not the full truth, but the version he could survive. He said Shanann had harmed the girls, and he had reacted. It was the lie of a coward seeking mercy through manipulation. But in that moment, the world shifted. The mask cracked. The father, the husband, the suburban man next door, gone. What remained was something hollow, something cold. The real confession would come days later, in fragments, in letters, in quiet moments of supposed redemption. But even then, the words could not capture the depth of what had been lost. Because beyond the crime scene, beyond the cameras and the courtroom, lay a question that would never find peace: how does love die so completely, and leave nothing human behind? When the truth emerged, it didn't just end a family, it split two of them apart forever. On one side sat Shanann's parents, broken yet dignified, staring across a courtroom at the man who had destroyed their world. On the other, Chris's parents, trembling, confused, clinging to the belief that their son wasn't a monster. Between them stretched a silence no sentence could ever fill. The courtroom air was thick, almost sacred. No one breathed too loudly. The judge's voice carried the weight of finality, but the true punishment was already visible, in the faces of those left behind. Shanann's mother wept without sound, clutching a framed photograph like a lifeline. Her father's eyes stayed locked on Chris, searching for something: remorse, humanity, or even recognition. He found none. Chris stood expressionless, as if watching someone else's story unfold. In that stillness, the depth of his detachment became clear. The man who once promised to protect was now the reason protection meant nothing. The family he destroyed had been his own. And yet, outside that courtroom, another family was also grieving, differently, quietly. Chris's parents, especially his mother Cindy, struggled to comprehend how the boy she raised, the gentle child she once rocked to sleep, could commit something so incomprehensible. Her grief became defense. Her confusion turned to denial. And soon, the narrative split into two versions of truth, one shaped by justice, the other by blood. Letters were written, apologies half-formed. Some were returned unopened. Others never sent. The emotional battlefield extended beyond law, it invaded faith, forgiveness, and identity. Each side lived in a separate timeline, one trying to mourn, the other trying to rewrite. The media turned the trial into a national obsession. Comment sections became war zones. Strangers chose sides, dissecting families already torn apart. The pain became public property. And somewhere in a Colorado cell, Chris began writing about redemption, about finding God, about forgiveness. But the families he left behind didn't need his scripture. They needed their daughters, their granddaughters, their peace. The verdict was final, but closure never came. Because justice cannot resurrect what love has lost. In the end, the Watts case didn't just reveal one man's darkness, it exposed how tragedy consumes everyone connected to it. And when a family shatters in two directions, there are no survivors, only fragments of what once was. Long after the courtroom went silent, the world refused to look away. Every second of footage, every photograph, every tear became digital evidence in the public's obsession. The Watts family tragedy wasn't just a case anymore, it was a mirror. Millions stared into it, not to see justice, but to see themselves. Social media turned grief into spectacle. True crime channels replayed every body cam clip, every interrogation. Comment sections swelled with fury, pity, theories. Strangers became detectives overnight, dissecting the tone of Chris's voice, the angle of Shanann's smile, the last words she ever posted. Her videos, once symbols of joy, became ghostly echoes of what was about to vanish. People claimed to know who to blame. Some demonized Chris, others searched for meaning in Nichol Kessinger's silence. And yet beneath all the noise was a collective ache, a realization that the life they had watched, liked, and shared was never real. For the digital world, truth had become entertainment, headlines promised new confessions, thumbnails screamed exclusive revelations, and the more people clicked, the less human the story became. The family that once seemed so ordinary had become global currency for curiosity. And still, the unanswered questions lingered. Why did Chris keep changing his story? Why did Nichol vanish without a trace? Was this love twisted into obsession, or emptiness mistaken for desire? Every theory pulled the audience deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. The tragedy no longer belonged to the people who lived it, it belonged to everyone watching. We built empathy and judgment side by side. We scrolled through grief, replayed pain, and whispered our opinions as though the dead could hear. Even years later, the algorithm still resurrects their faces. Shannon's cheerful voice still plays in timelines like a haunting lullaby from a world that no longer exists. And Chris, confined to a cell, remains more visible than ever, his letters and prayers turned into digital relics for strangers to analyze. The world didn't just witness the destruction of a family. It participated, unknowingly, relentlessly, in keeping it alive. Because in the age of endless viewing, tragedy never dies. It loops, replays, breathes through pixels. And somewhere in that endless scroll, we stopped being witnesses, and became accomplices in remembering. Even after death, Shannon never disappeared, her voice still fills timelines. Her laughter still echoes through screens. Her words, "I love my family so much," still play across millions of feeds. She became what few ever do, a living ghost in the digital age. A presence that lingers, reminding the world that perfection can be the most fragile illusion of all. Each video she made, the home tours, the birthday songs, the bedtime kisses, was meant to preserve love. Instead, they became evidence of what was stolen. Watching them now feels almost sacred and unbearable at once. You can see it in her eyes, hope battling exhaustion, joy masking hurt, the silent plea of a woman trying to keep something whole that was already crumbling. Her posts remain untouched, like a museum of a life frozen mid-sentence. The captions speak of gratitude, loyalty, family, words that now carry unbearable weight. It's as if she left behind not just memories, but proof that she existed, that her story mattered, that her daughters laughed, that her husband once smiled for real. But the internet is cruel in how it remembers. Every tribute shares space with mockery, every comment thread a battlefield of empathy and judgment. The same place where Shannon sought comfort became the arena where her legacy is debated. And then, there's Nichol Kessinger, vanished into silence, erased from public life, yet permanently embedded in the narrative. Her absence speaks louder than her voice ever could. To this day, her name summons anger, speculation, obsession. The woman who once existed in private is now immortalized in whispers and shadows. Chris's prison letters mention both women, one as salvation, the other as sin. But in truth, both haunt him. Each represents a version of himself he can never reclaim. And in those endless nights inside his cell, every word he writes is a futile attempt to resurrect what he buried. The Watts home is gone now. Torn down, erased from the map, but not from memory. It exists eternally online, reconstructed in photos, in comments, in analysis videos. Some ghosts don't fade. They replay. They reappear every time someone presses play, every time a stranger searches her name. And that's the tragedy of modern death, the body may be gone, but the algorithm never lets the soul rest. There are two kinds of prisons, the one made of concrete, and the one built from memory. Chris Watts lives inside both. In Wisconsin's Dodge Correctional Institution, his days follow an unchanging rhythm, metal doors, fluorescent lights, silence broken only by the shuffle of shoes down cold corridors. But the real confinement isn't physical. It's internal. It's the endless replay of what he can't undo. Every morning he wakes before dawn. He reads, prays, writes. He speaks of redemption now, of finding God, of forgiveness, of peace. But even his words feel haunted, shaped by guilt masquerading as faith. His letters from prison drift between confession and denial. In one breath, he blames the devil, in another, he claims enlightenment. Yet every sentence circles the same void, an emptiness that no scripture can fill. He tells interviewers that he's found forgiveness. That he sees his daughters in dreams, that they visit him, smiling. But the world outside isn't sure if those dreams are mercy or punishment. Because some hauntings are too personal to name. Inmates call him quiet, polite, detached. A man who keeps to himself, who flinches when news stories mention his name. He no longer belongs to society, yet society never lets him go. Every few months, a new video, a new article, a new letter from Chris Watts goes viral. And with each resurgence, his crimes are reborn, his past replayed like a nightmare that refuses to end. He is both forgotten and unforgettable. A man erased from life but permanently etched into the digital afterlife. Inside that cell, time is supposed to heal. But time can't forgive. It can only remind. Every prayer he whispers echoes against the steel, unanswered. Every breath he takes is borrowed from the lives he stole. He writes about Nichol Kessinger too, never in anger, always with distance. He calls her a mistake, yet never denies that she was the beginning of his unraveling. For him, she became both fantasy and excuse. For the world, she remains a question mark, the name behind his transformation, the shadow of the life he chose over his own blood. And still, there's no peace, not for him. Not for anyone who's watched this story unfold. Because this isn't just about one man in a cell, it's about the dark symmetry of guilt and attention. About how even the worst among us crave to be understood. Chris Watts will die behind those walls, but his name will outlive him, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a reminder. That even monsters are made in the image of men who once smiled for the camera. For all the interviews, letters, and confessions, the truth of the Watts case remains fractured, like a mirror shattered but never swept away. Each piece reflects something different: guilt, obsession, denial, love twisted into control. And even now, years later, the most haunting question is not what Chris Watts did, but why. There was no life insurance fortune, no sudden rage, no psychotic break. There was only a quiet man who decided one morning that freedom mattered more than family, and the world still cannot comprehend how such stillness can conceal such evil. How does a man erase everything he once claimed to love, and then calmly drive to work as though nothing happened? Experts have tried to explain it. Some call it narcissism, others psychopathy, a complete lack of empathy disguised beneath suburban politeness. But labels are too clean for something this senseless. What happened in that Colorado home was not madness, it was indifference perfected. His behavior before the murders reads like a checklist of transformation: the gym routine, the secrecy, the affair, the detachment. It wasn't a sudden storm, it was erosion. He didn't explode, he simply disappeared from himself. Each decision was a small betrayal, each lie a quiet rehearsal for the unthinkable. And then there's Nichol Kessinger. Her name remains an open wound in the case, the woman whose presence ignited his reinvention and whose silence now fuels endless speculation. Did she know? Did she suspect? The evidence never proved complicity, but the emotional gravity of her existence in his life cannot be denied. She was the mirror he built his fantasy around, and when the reflection cracked, he chose destruction over honesty. But even with every timeline analyzed, every message decoded, something deeper remains unseen, that invisible moment where ordinary life turns toward horror. It's a mystery beyond forensics, beyond psychology. It lives in the thin line between desire and delusion, between the image of happiness and the need to control it. Chris Watts will never fully tell the truth, because even he doesn't know it. His mind lives in fragments: guilt, self-pity, selective memory. And so the case remains suspended in unfinished sentences and unanswered prayers. Perhaps that's why it still haunts us. Because the Watts story isn't just about murder, it's about the hidden potential for darkness in everyday life. About how quickly love can decay into possession, and how normal people can become strangers to themselves. We may never know the complete truth of that morning, but maybe that's the lesson, that the most terrifying evil doesn't arrive with warning or fury, that it arrives quietly, wearing a smile we thought we could trust. Every generation has a crime that forces it to look inward. A single story that becomes more than tragedy, more than outrage. The What's case became that mirror. It revealed not just what one man did, but what our world has become. A place where love is measured in posts, where pain hides behind filters, and where the most ordinary faces can conceal the darkest emptiness. Long after the headlines faded, the images remain. Shanann's laughter in family videos. Bella and Celeste's small voices singing through old clips. Chris's expressionless stare in the courtroom, hollow yet strangely calm. Each fragment of footage loops endlessly online, reminders of how fragile the human heart can be when stripped of empathy. But the truth is, this story isn't just about Chris Watts. It's about all of us, about the illusions we build, the perfection we chase, and the silence we ignore in the people closest to us. It's about the cost of pretending everything's fine while something sacred quietly breaks. Shanann's digital footprint, meant to celebrate life, became her memorial. Every video she shared was an act of faith, faith that love could still hold a fractured family together. In that sense, her legacy is not her death, but her effort to keep loving when it no longer felt safe to do so. And for Chris, the cell he occupies is more than punishment. It's reflection, a life stripped of performance, a soul forced to face the echo of his own decisions. Every prayer he writes, every apology he crafts, is a futile attempt to rebuild the humanity he traded away. We watch these stories because they terrify us, not for their brutality, but for their familiarity. Because deep down, we know this wasn't just the collapse of one home. It was a glimpse into the quiet dangers of modern life, the emotional distance, the digital masks, the hunger for validation that replaces connection. In the end, the What story doesn't give us closure. It gives us warning, that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it holds your hand. And so, this tragedy lives on, not in the prison cell, not in the headlines, but in the reflection of every person who dares to ask. If this could happen in that perfect home, what secrets are hiding in ours?